So then we are back with more understanding from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in ourselves studying the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage. So then we understand the prophecies of the time of the end, as then we verify precisely then during the time of Yirmiyahu the prophet. He gave many understandings of the time of the end related with the Israelic prophetic understanding from the time of Moshe, because those were the basic instructions. So then we find ourselves studying during a time where then Yirmiyahu the prophet, he was explaining many areas of his time and the time yet in the future, while he himself serving as then the prophet. So then he was explaining in a time of restoration and reduction, and then the reduction time we have then the balance with the time of the Messiah, because the Messiah made reference of the time of restoration, because the 24th chapter was related then with the time of restoration and also reduction. So when you read then Yirmiyahu the 61st chapter, you have to link up with what the Messiah said also, so then you can make the proper understanding. So then, precisely then Yirmiyahu spoke of the time of restoration. Then as an extra, you understand then the Messiah is speaking of the time of reduction, because both of them, they are the same time linked. So then, we find then the first topic of understanding obviously comes from the Quran. Absolutely important, there is no question in terms of what we should study, starting with the Holy Quran. There is no other option, because the restoration comes from the first contact of the Creator and Ibrahim. So the natural fact is studying the Quran. There is a very important section of it where we find many areas where we can understand then what they meant in terms of sacrifice. So then, we read from the understanding of the 22nd chapter of Sura al-Hajj. We find many areas explaining then the camels, explaining then the sacrifice, then the understanding what it means sacrifice related with camels. Those were explained before. So then, there are many other areas where we find in ourselves then relating this Holy Scripture with sacrifices. But what do they mean? What were they speaking of? What were they then wishing for? So then, from the perspective of themselves as then the people leading, as we can read then, thus we have made animals at your leadership. What they meant is the Creator gave them those animals related with trade. The first understanding was Joseph. So then, in the 22nd chapter of Sura, 22nd al-Hajj, we find then the 22nd chapter, 33rd verse. In these, then explains, then animals for sacrifice, you have benefits, the meat, the hide, for a fixed time. In the end, their place of sacrifice is near the ancient house. To every nation, then, we have given the rites of sacrifice that celebrate the name of the Creator. And then, very important, over then the provisions He, the Creator, gave them from animals fit for sacrifice. So then, we begin our quest of this study understanding then what they are trying to explain regarding, obviously, the second son. Because making a reference of sacrifice during the time where they were the leaders of the trade, it kind of would not fit. Would not fit because the situation related with the leadership of the trade of the time, they would not have truly time to do, in quote, tabernacling. Wasn't for their task to do tabernacling. What they meant was, you understand what is fit for sacrifice in terms of what they were bringing. They were bringing many areas of trade, for instance, ivory, or then gold, or then silver, or then salt. They were in charge of many areas of trade of the time, and there were many caravans. Imagine the time of Egypt when there were traders coming from everywhere, and they were also in charge. So then every time we read it from the Holy Quran, we don't, in a specific sense, shift our understandings towards tabernacling. Because it's not the function of the first son. The first son was related with trade and leadership of the Gentile level. But then what they make a reference of is stating what you have to make a space in yourselves of giving a portion of your earnings. When you do this, you are making, in quote, a sacrifice of your provisions, of your earnings. It's a related understanding of the word sacrifice. But then we also understand contracts back then, known as covenants, were done via sacrifice of animals. So those were then obviously considered in terms of a contract related with a trade of Gentile level. As far as tabernacling, then is another section then related with the second son. It requires more study because it contains the plan of salvation. And then as we understand later, then a lot of people scoundrelized the scriptures because they did not know how to translate them. So a whole generation of people came out with ideas in their minds, and they simply are fables. They don't exist. So then, returning the basics, studying the Holy Quran, we find then, because of the sections of events, we find then they are being very grateful for the Creator of having the relationship with Ibrahim, and their lineage came from Ibrahim. Then the Ishmaelites being very grateful for having those camels. They can do trade, and they were very important during the time, and they are important, and they are very grateful for the Creator for giving them. So in exchange they give a portion of what they have. Though when they speak amongst themselves, when they do contract, they do understand the sacrificial contract made amongst themselves, so they are bound of what they told each other, and they make their deals then very solidly. But then we understand when it's related with sacrifice, related with tabernacling, then we have to branch away from the understanding of the Holy Quran, never questioning the Quran. We simply are making an analysis, so then we have to filter and make sure those translators, they were speaking those words related with each objective of both sons. Because as we understand from the holy language of the Quran to the other languages, they use words, sometimes they are not compatible. In English, there is a big problem. From the Israelic lineage, when you read what Yohanan wrote in Hebrews 7:12, then there is a change of the priestly line, so there is then a change of the instructions. It's not change of replacement. It is completion of the first. So it's not the same. It changes absolutely 100% the understanding in the mind of the person. So this is what then we are trying to find in the Holy Quran, never questioning its holy aspect, but being concerned with the content to make sure then those translators, they were in a proper state of mind when they were translating those documents. So then we understand from this section of it related with sacrifice the importance of the trade back then, and they were the leaders. And precisely this is what they're going to do when the Chinese system becomes more evident. As we already know, the Bank of China and the Citigroup, they are joined up. The mortgage bust in the U.S. a while back then was, in quote, purchased by the Chinese, or they are doing trade with junky mortgages bust. It's a bad deal because they understand those were junky deals, but they are buying the system. They are not interested in the mortgage themselves. But we think we are smart. We are making a deal, mortgages. There was a bust over there. There was a huge deficit related with it. What the heck, give them. They are not interested in the mortgages themselves. They're interested in the system. But our government, in quote, smart, they go with any kind of a flow goes through without scrutinizing, and there it is. So very simply then, the next 36 months we're going to have more of these updating in their own system, and then when the time comes, then they simply introduce their system. And that's when it becomes worldwide, then the sons of Ishmael, mostly in Arabia, they're going to make the proper decisions. And the world is going to watch it, because the time of restoration, ever since the time of the Creator, spoke with the first human being. Quite interesting. There is a very important section of it where there are words used in, for instance, Sura 22nd, al-Hajj shows us, and yet they ask you to quicken the punishment, understanding the time of the end or the closing of the age. It is interesting because they acknowledge there is then a divine day of judgment. But then the Creator won't fail in His promise. Allah won't. Surely a day in the sight of your God, the Creator, is like 1,000 years of your calculation. Quite interesting the way they use the word calculation. When it comes from a group of people related with a trade, they were always calculating. So then you begin to understand some of these words as part of their everyday living. It doesn't mean that precisely this is what it means, but we can understand some of the traces coming from the tradeship of these people. Very important. So then, later on we find other signs, other understandings, other warnings from the Holy Quran. But then we must understand from the objectives of the first son and the second son. Always scrutinizing and never questioning the Quran. It is very dangerous questioning the Quran. But what we can do is studying these other languages other than the holy original language of the Quran, and then making sure those words they are matching with the original manuscript. So then when we branch away from the Quran related with the second son, tabernacling, then we do our quest and also do the filtering in the language of Aramaic, because the writings of Hebrews are in Aramaic. It's not Hebrew. So then we can scrutinize the entire scripture from the Quran until the last Megillah of Galah. The entire scripture must be updated, clean, restored with original understanding, starting then with Ibrahim, first son and the second son. So a lot of work to do. Please stay tuned.